The same winter, 1688, the Prince of Orange, coming over into England, was admitted as their king to the exercise of government, and thereafter being embraced by Scotland, he, by the advice and help of the corrupt old statesmen whose hands were reeking in the blood of the saints, condescended to a form of church government as was most suitable to the people's inclinations, a model vastly inconsistent with the principles of the Church of Scotland, which holds that her government is of divine right, a far better foundation than the inclinations of the people. December 19, 1688. Upon the false report of the burning of Kirkcudbright by the Papists, our friends in a rash and precipitated manner joined the bulk and body of the backslidden country, which by them was easily compiled with, because our ministers preached it up as a duty, contrary to their former doctrine. About the beginning of the year 1689, these three ministers, Messrs. Shields, Linning, and Boyd, having had, unknown to us, their private conferences with the indulged ministers in and about Glasgow, in order to the adjusting the differences that were betwixt them, wheedled us over into a belief, under plausible like pretexts, that their zeal to the covenants was the same as formerly, which could not by us be any otherwise understood, when at some general meetings it was concluded that the covenants should be renewed, in order to which several good overtures were agreed to, yet at the same time, by the conferences, as above, with these indulged ministers, Messrs. Linning and Boyd, gave clear proofs of their underhand dealing in their proposing, that a bond of association might be drawn up in order to others joining with us, to which the eminent and pious Mr. Shields replied, that our covenants were our bond of association, and should as would not adhere to these, and such as would not adhere to these, we should not join with them. At which time it was concluded that our covenants should be renewed by a few of every shire in a marital manner, and thereafter that they should be renewed in every shire according to the foresaid form and order by all our number therein. But March 3rd, 1689, when they were about to be renewed, the former overtures being laid aside and the ministers being then at the place where they renewed the covenants, though not at the place appointed by the general meeting, which was to be at Linlithgow, they sent their posts contrary to our former conclusions, to dissuade us from bringing along our arms, which too generally was complied with, except by a few, who observed the former appointment, and that the rather because they saw the malignant interest twisted in contrary to former resolutions, which was evident not only from what Mr. Boyd and a few with him did rashly and abruptly, without the consent of our general meeting, in his going into Glasgow and reading the Prince of Orange's declaration, which greedy grasping of the man's at that occasion, to free himself of the yoke which he reckoned a bondage in witnessing to the cause of God with the faithful remnant. We say that his former promises to the indulged ministers came clearly to light, to whom he had given promises to break the divide, the remnant in Scotland, which was manifest from the testimonials that he received of them for his license when he went abroad, and also upon this and many other considerations. It was clear enough the desire that these ministers had, especially Messrs. Boyd and Linning, to grasp at untimous liberty. So also, upon the back of the renovation of these three solemn engagements at Lismagow, these three ministers hurried a considerable party of the professors of the West into a conjunction with these who had lately pursued us and shed our brethren's blood, that is, in guarding of the Convention of Estates, which was afterwards bewailed by many, when they came to see the evil of it. At the renovation of which covenants on Borland Hill of Lismagow, Mr. Shields said, quote, "From this day shall be dated either our reformation or defection," unquote. Which of the two was truest? By what followed the reader may conjecture. That summer, 1689, under the conduct of William Cleland, Lieutenant Colonel to Angus, who, according to the 23rd Act of the Convention of Estates, levied a regiment of the suffering remnant, which compliance of theirs therein was contrary to their former principles and professions, in complying with a malignant interest, as they had been taught by their ministers when faithful. Yet notwithstanding, at this juncture, these three ministers chided us into a compliance in conjunction with the malignant party, before that there was any evidences given of their abandoning mourning over and laying aside of their former practices, as they had been destructive to the cause and people of God. Which piece of defection was too easily complied with by these of our number, who were for worldly gain and preeminence, and yet nevertheless it was testified against by some. That same summer, 1679, the North, being in an uproar by the fourth act of the Convention of Estates, the South and West being commanded to rendezvous many of our brethren, kept up rendezvousing days with the late persecuting gentry, little to some's comfort, who, espying the evil thereof, witnessed against it both then and afterward. June 17, 1689, William and Mary were accepted of and admitted to the crown, but not covenant-wise, howbeit the covenants in Scotland are to be holden as the coronation oath, which all magistrates, according to the standing laws of this nation, are to swear before they can be admitted to bear rule in this covenanted land, as you may read in our third declaration. Shortly after, July 22nd, their church government being settled, running back to the 1592 with its legal establishment and so overleaping our best times, according to the inclinations of the people, a thing which, without doubt, had as its tendency an eye to the pleasing of the prelatic and Presbyterian party, as they might be termed, which may easily be understood from the general terms of the Protestant interest of the covenanted work of Reformation, which settlement of church government, as it opened a door to the prelatic party to plead for a share of church communion, and yet without an acknowledgment of their bypast offenses, so it allayed their fears of being brought into condign punishment for their former miscarriages, so that as the general epithet in Protestant interest was not frightsome upon the one hand to the prelatic party, our adversaries, so on the other hand it not unfitly answered the character of such as made interest more their study than God's glory, as those of the indulged and tolerated party of both church and state then, who were more ready to grasp at secular preferments and worldly interest than in things pertaining to themselves, than they were to have the house of God purged from that leaven of defection wherewith it had been defiled, by which alteration of times, though not of manners, our enemies were advanced, and those of the ministers whom we had just exceptions against, and whom our ministers could not own before as their brethren, were, notwithstanding upon this new revolution, joined with the great part of the land, and that before ever they had declared any remorse for their former courses. Yea, our ministers, though formerly doctrinally they had taught us not to join in affinity with the people of such abominations, yet how forward were they then to bring us to a union with such ministers as they themselves had formerly declared their just exceptions against, and this, as was said, before ever such ministers had evidenced their remorse, whereby our teachers who formerly were leading us into Canaan were now bringing us back to Egypt. Anon 1690, the Parliament by their act indicted and appointed the first General Assembly as the first specimen of their Erastianism over the new constitute church, which afterwards came to be practical, as was seen in their frequent calling, dissolving, and adjourning of these General Assemblies, even sometimes to an indefinite day. To which General Assembly the suffering remnant being instigated by the three ministers to give in a paper, as they had done before to the Convention of Estates, which paper, as it contained an enumeration of the sins of the land, though not so particular as some of the remnant would have had it, was appointed to be given into that assembly by 10 or 12 of each shire, and they to crave a redress of these particular grievances, which was so far from being acquiesced unto by that assembly, that it could not so much as have a hearing by reading. And though that those three ministers knew many of the suffering parties had averseness from meddling with these backslidden ministers, convocate in the assembly until they had declared their resentment of their former courses, yet how industriously did these three ministers in their going through the country break many of our number, and brought them into a compliance with these their designs to acknowledge such as the lawful judicatory, whom formerly they had refused to own, as long as just exception stood in the way. As for what papers the three ministers offered to that assembly, their assembly, Acts 1690, declares whatever reception they got. However, it is observable that these three ministers sadly succumbed when, at their reception into the communion of that backslidden church, they patiently received a reprimand, which was in effect for their faithfulness to the interest and cause of God, whereby they gave these backslidden ministers ground to believe that they were repenting for their former zeal. And also the honest party, ground to allege that especially Messrs. Linning and Boyd had never been honest in heart to the cause of God. As to Mr. D.H., of whom before, after his release from the enemy, he preaching here and there, as he was called, was for his freedom against the present courses of defection, as well of those, that is, the three ministers who had lately gone from us as others, much hated, slighted, and despised. So, what through one thing, what through another, the reverend godly old man was rendered useless, so that he got over to Ireland. He lived some few years there and died peaceably, witnessing against the defections and for Christ's crown rights. Now, the suffering remnant being without the help of leaders, their wilderness lot came to be more terrible, like unto them, wherein they met with many assaults and sore trials, not only by such as had left them, but also their trials came to be sharp with reference to others. For shortly after that we were deprived of our leaders through their backsliding, came over out of Ireland 2 women pretending themselves to be somewhat, where through some of the more simple of our number, both in the West East and in Fife, were ready to be endangered with them. But process of time discovered their naughtiness of these persons, and our friends, being better informed concerning them, came to be more cautious in meddling with them. And albeit we had several temptations by such as were not of us, that is, Messrs. R. and G., to call such of ourselves as might be thought fit to the office of the ministry, and dispense the ordinances to us. Yea, these 2 foresaid offered themselves to preach unto us, yet got no reception. For we desire still, through the Lord's help and assistance, to keep off from every unwarrantable and unpracticable course, although we be otherwise repented by the generation. Yet notwithstanding of all these trials that the godly remnant met with from both hands, yet the Lord in his mercy still preserved a witnessing remnant from both right and left-hand errors and extremes. And though, to our grief, many of our number were greatly shaken as to their former zeal and steadfastness in the cause of God, after these 3 ministers had left us, and before the general meetings were erected, being for some time deprived of general meetings also, where through we were like persons in a staggering condition, not having fixed a stand, we thought it fit to call general meetings again. But when gathered and searching into one another's judgments as to the state of the testimony, we found ourselves to be but a mixed company, whereupon we purged our meetings from all such as had sinfully joined with the courses of the times, and were defending the same, and also set apart days for fasting and humiliation before the Lord. For what accession any of us had to any piece of compliance, which thing, to our felt experience, we saw to be so far countenanced of God, as that without ostentation we might have called the place Boheme, having got our meetings purged of such as had made defection to the contrary party. We emitted a declaration August 10th, 1692, which speaks for itself, and whereby we declared the state of the testimony as we were purposed and resolved, through divine assistance, to maintain against both church and state, in as far as they are opposite to and averse from the maintaining of the covenanted work of Reformation of the Church of Scotland. Which declaration, as it was a testimony of our adherence to what our forefathers had been contending for, so also it was so far displeasing to our adversaries that they caused apprehend some of our brethren, but thereafter were set at liberty without the least restriction or acknowledgment of their authority. This declaration had also that effect with it, that many came to get their eyes opened who had them shut before,